And that's the reality.
Because they're sharks. The banks, in their own documents, want vertical integration. As Maurice Strong said, they want to wreck the economy so we all go on collectivist welfare so they can call the shots on everything.
Exactly. They're power freaks, and that's how they get their jollies, and that's it. It's the only trick they know. They're collectivists. They believe in that ideology of collectivism with all-powerful government at the top and people serving the state at the bottom. And that's just fine with them because they know that they're in the structure either at the top or far enough toward the top to have a very comfortable life while the rest of us are servants. So it's as simple as that. And the trouble is with most Americans, they can't imagine that there are people out there with that kind of a vision because it's not their vision. They think there is no one that actually wants to rule the world, but they're so wrong.
History shows that elites always want to rule the world. They always dominate. They always enslave. But somehow this psychological idea got implanted that corruption doesn't exist in government.
Many a young maid lost her baubles to my trade. Many a soldier shed his lifeblood on my blade. The bastards hung me in the spring of 25, but I am still alive.
G. Edward Griffin is our guest. Short segment, long segment coming up. We're going to break down what's happening currently. But G. Edward, in this brief 5-minute segment, can you give people an overview of, say, Norman Dodd and the Reese Committee, the Church Committee, Carol Quigley, if the documents from the elite, similar to more modern ones like Eco-Science, written by the White House Science Czar, where they admit planetary government. And then now Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General 2 weeks ago, editorial in the New York Times titled, "We Can Do It," saying global government is here and it's going to be funded by carbon taxes. We'll talk about that coming up. But a few founding documents for people that want to do research.
Yeah, I think that's important to get as close to the roots of this as possible. Of course, you can go back practically to Adam and Eve if you want to, but you don't need to go that far. One of the most eye-opening documents that I discovered early in my research, Alex, was the testimony of a fellow by the name of Norman Dodd. Norman Dodd, this was in the 1940s, right after the end of World War II. There was a lot of concern among a lot of Americans, and particularly some newspaper editors. The Hearst newspaper chain in particular was very concerned and writing editorials about the tax-exempt foundations in America, obviously promoting what was in those days blatant communist propaganda. I found that hard to believe when I read those editorials. But I went to the documents themselves from the tax-exempt foundations, and lo and behold, they were right. They were publishing essays written by, guess who? Joseph Stalin, praising the glories of communism and socialism and how the end of capitalism was the only way for the world to go and so forth. This was stuff being distributed by some of the largest, most prestigious American tax-exempt foundations. And it was just amazing because it was hard for me to believe that would happen, but there it was in the historical record. And so the Hearst papers and others, a lot of newspapers around the country, were writing editorials exposing this. And, of course, that triggered a lot of alarm on the part of the American people, and they wanted their government. People in those days, like today, still thought that their government, represented them, and so they wanted their government to investigate this, not realizing that already, even in those days, our own government was being heavily influenced by tax-exempt foundations and the financial interests that supported them. But anyway, the idea was that they wanted an investigation of these tax-exempt foundations to see if they were, in fact, un-American, is the word they used. That they were advocating systems that required the destruction of the American way of life and using a process that was not constitutional. I mean, the American system is designed to be changed if necessary, and if it's the will of the people, but there's a constitutional path for that change. And so they were concerned about groups such as the Communist Party in those days pursuing an unconstitutional path through a violent revolution and that sort of thing. So there was a committee established in Congress, headed by Congressman Carol Reese, and I've forgotten the exact title of the committee. It's a long title, but they just referred to it as the Reese Committee, and its purpose was to investigate tax-exempt foundations. Well, that's just background. They hired a fellow by the name of Norman Dodd to be their chief investigator. And Norman Dodd he came from banking circles, actually. Excuse me. He had worked for some of the largest banks of New York. He knew how the power structure worked and all of that, and he was not very happy with it, as a matter of fact. He had left banking, and, well, we won't go through his career, but eventually they did select him to be the chief investigator. So now we finally get to the Norman Dodd testimony, which I ran across, I guess in the middle 1960s, when I was researching a lot of the government documents put out by the House Committee on Un-American Activities and the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee. And one of those obscure documents, and believe me, I had stacks of these things that probably, if they were all put on top of each other, would probably go 8 feet to the ceiling of the house here. And one of those obscure documents, I ran across the testimony of Norman Dodd, and it almost knocked my socks off. He was basically saying that when he investigated these tax-exempt foundations, he found out that there was nestled inside of them literally a cabal of people, very powerful, wealthy people, who were trying to destroy America.
Stay there. We'll be right back. It says the Rockefeller Foundation put it on at Rockefeller University. It was secret, but they told the Times some of what happened. And they said, why all the secrecy? They wanted to speak rich to rich without worrying anything they could, and said would end up in the newspapers, painting them as an alternative world government, he said, because this meeting went on a week before Bilderberg this year. Now, you then see the Rockefeller Foundation as the nexus or the directorship, and you're the expert on this, I'm just telling the listeners about it, of all the new carbon tax laws where they decide who can have a business, where they decide what gets developed, what governments fund. This is the private banking cartel through government power in a tyrannical fashion, taking complete control over society. Please continue.
Yes, well, boy, there's so much on that, and it all, as you said earlier, it goes back to the earliest beginnings, of which I'm aware, where they actually talked about these strategies, was when the tax-exempt foundations amassed tremendous amounts of financial firepower. I mean, we're talking about, as you mentioned, the Carnegie Endowment Fund for International Peace, the Rockefeller Foundation Fund, the Ford Foundation. People cannot imagine the tremendous amount of money that these tax-exempt foundations have in their bank accounts and invested in producing constant flow of money. And they use it. The general impression is that they use it for philanthropic purposes. But now we're talking about Norman Dodd, who started to investigate these organizations and found out that under the name of, or the cover of philanthropy, they were actually doing social engineering, and they were doing a government change, and they were trying to change the characteristic of the American society. And that was quite astounding. And when I read this testimony, I just found it almost impossible to believe. And so I was traveling in those days back to Virginia, and we had hired a television crew, and we were putting together a little documentary on some topic. It wasn't this at all. I've even forgotten the topic at the present time. But I do know that we had a weekend where we had no appointments and no interviews. And so I decided to see if I could locate Norman Dodd, because I knew the last reference I had, they said he lived in Virginia someplace. And so I just opened up the telephone directory and started to look through to see if I could find how many Norman Dodds there were. There were only about 3. And so I decided to call the first one on the list, and it was him. It was almost incredible. Good luck. I said, Mr. Dodd, are you the same one who was the investigator for the Reese Committee? He said, yes, that is I. And I said, well, how wonderful. I'm here, I have a camera crew, and I'm interested in your testimony. Would you like to speak for our cameras? He said, Well, of course, young man, of course. This is many years ago. And so we got him over to where we were staying, and I actually captured his whole story on videotape. And it was a good thing because by that time he was advanced in years, and he was not very well at all. And it wasn't, I think it was less than a year later that he passed away. So we were fortunate enough to get his testimony again, this time spoken to our cameras. And I had a chance to question him. So I became very, very personally familiar with his story. And I might say that if anybody is interested in this, you can find the complete description of what he said, and you can find even a reference to the film, the documentary film, which we produced based on his testimony, which is called The Hidden Agenda.